Hello, Rabbi.
Hello, how are you?
I'm fabulous. How are you?
Thank God, doing well.
Good, good. So
We're back here. It's number 3, third episode, and we know that
episode.
3 in Judaism is chazaka. It is a sign of strength. It's a sign of permanence. When you do something 3 times, it's in some ways like an oath, even if an oath wasn't taken of a good, especially when it comes to a good thing. So, l'chaim, this is our 3rd episode for a chazaka, and excited to be here.
And how much should I drink?
Okay.
Today's title is Mystical or Mythical.
Okay.
Okay. But first you want to announce.
Yes. So we have an email set up.
Mm-hmm.
It should be at the bottom of the screen. Questions at betweenthel'chaim.com. If you have questions, topic suggestions, you're looking for clarification, or just want to tell us how good we look on camera, please send us an email and let us know what you think.
Fabulous. Great.
Okay.
Okay. So here's a topic that I thought of that I have questions about. The stories in the Bible, are they true? Are they made up? How do we know that they're true or made up? And I have a lot of questions about this. How do we know that Moses didn't write the Torah? So one thing at a time. Let's start with Moses.
Okay.
Would that be good?
Right.
How do we know he didn't write it when he was up at Mount Sinai for 40 days?
Well, first of all, Moses did transcribe the Torah. He is the one that actually put outside of the 10 Commandments. So I think let's take a step back.
Wait, the Ten Commandments.
The 10 Commandments.
The
10 Commandments, as written in the Torah, those were the first set, because there were 2 sets. The first
Right.
that was broken, the second one. The first one was actually carved by God. The second one was carved by Moses.
And it was only the 10 Commandments, not the extension of
Not
each
the 5
commandment.
books of Moses, but as you see them as they're written in
The lengthy version.
in the book of Exodus, in the book of Deuteronomy. It's written 2 times. That is what was on the 10 Commandments,
Okay.
engraved in sapphire.
So the 10 Commandments are, thou shalt not kill.
Well, beginning, I'm God, your God. There should be no other gods, et cetera, including do not kill, do not steal, do not covet your neighbor's wife, et cetera. Keep the Sabbath holy, honor your mother and father. Those
Right.
10 Commandments, those were engraved on sapphire tablets, 2 square sapphire tablets.
Sapphire.
Sapphire.
How come they never depict that in the movies?
It was probably cheaper to use stone.
So how big were these stones?
That is a good question. I don't remember offhand, but they were quite heavy.
And how do we know that Moses didn't write them?
Well,
A quiet reply.
what's interesting. This actually addresses more than just the question of Moses, but how do you know that that the events of the Torah are true? What's fascinating about the Torah being given on Mount Sinai is that there were approximately 3 million people that experienced the giving of the Torah.
Yeah, but they didn't see it written.
Well, but as an experience, there's something going on over
Okay.
here. 3 million people saw the revelation of God. They heard God utter the first 2. They actually heard the first 2 of the 10 Commandments from God.
Okay.
So once you've had that experience, you understand that there's something here that's going on beyond just one person going up saying, I had a vision, and this is what I was told. Mm-hmm. So they experienced that. So that part of it was handed, 3 million people experiencing something, sharing it, and it goes from generation to generation, has a different level of truth than when one person says, I had an experience, this is the experience, and this is why you should follow me, and then people go and follow, and it kind of snowballs and creates, a narrative on its own. So I think when you talk about the truth of anything, truth is a very hard thing to pin down. But I think there's another question, I think, which has to be answered before, which is, why does it matter?
Because it does matter.
But why?
Because then it gets down to, is there a God?
Okay, but let's. People do a lot of things. People accept a lot of things. For example, most people will tell you have to drink 8-ounce glasses of water.
Mm-hmm.
Why?
That's because man said.
Because
a study was done.
Because a study was done, and but people will drink it and say, "Have you read the study?"
Okay.
No. How do you know it works? Eat this, don't eat that. Self-help books. People buy, we've talked about this before, self-help, tons of books, thousands of books in self-help. How many people actually, before they buy a book and read it and implement it, actually go through it and say, is this true? Is this real? Why is it so important that when we read the stories of the Bible, we suddenly become frozen? Is this true? Is this accurate? Did this really happen? What is it about the stories of the Bible that suddenly elicit within us this thing? It has to be absolutely documented truth, or else I can't accept anything that it says in this book. We don't live our life that way.
Well, I think we do.
How many things do we do in our lives that we take?
Well, we question a lot.
I don't think most people question most of what they do and accept.
Okay.
Thanksgiving. Most people in America have a Thanksgiving dinner.
Mm-hmm.
How many people actually have any clue why they have a Thanksgiving dinner, where it came from, what it's supposed to mean?
Well, I mean, I know why, but
what is Thanksgiving dinner?
It's the Indians welcomed the Pilgrims to America.
So there was a
welcoming. And then we killed them.
Okay. But then when did it become a holiday?
But this is bigger than that.
I understand, but we're getting somewhere here. But
okay.
But why did it become a national holiday? Why did our founding fathers at some point, when did our founding fathers incorporate this into the American tradition of living? When did it become a national holiday? Why is it a national holiday? Should it be a national holiday? Shouldn't it just be an obvious thing? So I think there's a lot of things that we do and we accept to be a certain way without ever really going back and saying, what actually happened? Is this really a true story? Did the Pilgrims were they even welcomed by the Indians? We don't even know if that was even true. Who was there to document it? So how do we know that that's true? And you'll say, well, there was 60, 70 people that were pilgrims. They had children. They passed it on generation to generation, et cetera, et cetera. So I think when we have what I find interesting about this question is, why is there such a reaction to this question of, did this really happen? How do we know that it happened?
Because we are saying that God created everything. We are in the image of God. And I think that that's a big question, and we should question it.
We always should question everything. But I think the fact that we react that way to it is a bigger piece of the proof that it's true than any other kind of discussion.
I don't see that.
And the reason is that we react to things that are true. So when somebody comes and says something, accuses you of something, friends, especially young teenagers, whatever it is, groups of friends, and they'll come over and they'll, one of them will accuse one of the other friends of, not being a good friend or whatever it is. When it's not true, you just kind of like, okay. But when it's true, it hits a nerve and we react. And often in psychology, we'll find the things that you react to are the things that deep down, even though you might outwardly deny it, but those are the things that deep down, they're hitting a nerve. They're hitting a raw nerve.
Okay, so let's.
And so what happens with the stories of the Torah is like this: if I could right now sit down and show you, without a doubt, that every single word in the Torah is true, and every story happened exactly as it happened, and every commandment was uttered by God exactly as it is, what would have to happen? What would be the next line in progression?
For us?
For anybody who actually now you would have.
If everybody realized that it was true.
And accepted it, and without a doubt, and we had all the proofs and everything else.
I think that we would look at things differently.
But what would you have to do? We would have to suddenly incorporate all the laws of the Torah, kosher our homes, start to observe the Shabbat.
Would we though?
Well, if God said you shouldn't put a razor to your face.
Listen, I believe in God, but it doesn't mean that I'm going to practice.
I understand that, but if I can show without a doubt that every single word in the Torah was given from the word, what would happen? I'd have a choice. Either I start to do everything that it says in the Torah, or I have to come to a justification why, even though I know that it's absolutely true, I'm not necessarily going to incorporate all of those precepts.
Right.
And that puts us in a very uncomfortable situation. Because we're not tomorrow morning going to change our lives like that.
Correct.
So I think what happens with the question of the proof is, it's not that we don't believe inherently that every single word of the Torah is true. I think the proof is that we react to it because we know that if we can actually prove it, if I accept it, then I'm in a bigger pickle. I'm in a bigger pickle.
How do you know?
I know.
Besides belief.
I said before, because I was told by my father and my mother, who were told by their parents, who were told by their parents, who were told by their parents 3,300 years ago.
Yeah.
We sat at Mount Sinai, and this is what was given.
But here's the next question. Proof.
That is proof. You want a picture? You want a photograph? I mean, as a newspaper, honestly, that would be nice, but... Yeah.
So I still didn't get my question answered. How do we know?
Every word in the Torah has been analyzed over 3,300 years.
By man.
By thousands and thousands and thousands, probably at this point millions of rabbis and laymen and housewives and students, and questioned and gone through. And you cannot, something which is not true would never be able to stand up to that kind of level of scrutiny. So that at the end of the day, the fact that it's constantly, even today, the same texts, when you study something, you want to know if it's true, open up the Talmud, open up the Kabbalah, start reading through it, start understanding the texts and the words, and you see how everything fits and everything meshes, and you understand this is not something that could have been written by man. This is not something that could have been put together by a person. Because every single word, as it is analyzed and as it is learned and as it is studied, you see how perfect and how it exactly belongs where it is. And there's Bible code. I mean, there's the Bible codes.
What? Bible codes? What is that?
There's different patterns that exist within the Torah. For example, if you start with the first tuf in the Torah from Bereshit, and you count 50 letters from the tuf, you get a vav, and 50 letters you get a resh, and 50 letters you get a vav and a resh and a hey, and it spells the word Torah all the way to the center of the Torah, and then backwards the other way around.
What? Really?
Yeah, and many other things of that nature.
So you're saying, because of the codes, Moses could not have done it?
I'm not saying because of the codes. What I'm saying is that by through the process of Torah study, the more one studies, the more one comes to appreciate that this is not a work that man could have put together. It's not something I can stand the one for. You want to know how I know it's true? I know it's true because I was told by my parents. How do they know it's true? Because it was told by their parents. An unbroken chain of 3,300 years ago.
Yeah, but lies can be done like that.
Oh no, not if you have 3 million people, especially Jews, 2 Jews, 3 opinions. How would you even be able to keep this going? Especially now, it's one thing if you said we lived always in the same geographic place, we were a very small people that stayed together, that we never intermingled with anybody else. But when you talk about the fact that we've been from the giving of the Torah, we were in Israel, Persia, Babylon, Rome, Greece, and we weren't just there. We intermingled with everybody. Even in Israel during the period of the Greeks, the Hellenists, we've been exposed to every one of the philosophies. We've been exposed to every one of the civilizations around the world, from ancient Greeks to the ancient Romans to the ancient Persians and the ancient Arabic philosophers. And yet the Torah is the one that's here today, and the other ones are kind of obscure. You study them maybe in a university, and then they kind of peak themselves out in modern philosophy. And with each one of those eras, the Torah has been filtered in a way through them because the people that studied them studied a student as a student. So the people that studied those studied this as well. And so there's a lot of, when you study, you come to understand it's not really something you can say, oh, here's the magic formula. This is how I know. Here's a picture, Moses coming down. This is exactly what happened, because there's no video. There's no pictures of it. But when you start to study and you have the tradition that's passed down generation to generation, then you put a complete thing together. Even the Hebrew language is such an amazing language, and you start to see how the letters and the words intermingle, why these 3 letters serve as a source for the word and
so
what
you're saying with that is, with the codes, the Torah is coded. For example, let me ask you a question.
And by the way, that's just like
But-
that's not the proof. It's just like an interesting thing that happens to be there, which just shows you. In other words, it's not like, oh, the Torah is coded, therefore that's why it's true. No, the Torah is true. And in addition to the studying, in addition to the transmission from family to family and all the other things, in addition to all that, there happens to be other things in there that make you go even more so, okay, there's even more.
Okay, but here's my question. It talks about Noah.
Yeah.
Okay. Noah was before
Yep.
the Ten Commandments. How do we know Noah was real?
Well, outside of the fact.
Because that's in the Torah.
Yeah. Outside of the fact that Moses was the seventh generation from Abraham. Abraham is the 10th generation from Noah. Noah is the 10th generation from Adam. Noah and Abraham, they overlapped. They knew each other.
Wait, Noah
and
Abraham
knew each other. He passed away when Abraham was 50 years old.
So wait a minute. So Abraham was around when the flood happened.
No, Abraham is many, many years later, a few hundred years after the flood. But according to the Torah, Noah lived 950 years.
So it was passed from Abraham to Noah.
Adam passed away, I think it was about 50 years before Noah was born. And then Noah was alive.
Adam?
Adam lived 930 years.
Okay.
Noah was born, I believe, within 100 years. I forgot the exact date.
So it was passed from
these
stories were passed
on from generation to generation, which is a lot of what you find in the Medrash as well.
So, so with Noah, let's say Noah spoke to Abraham.
Yeah.
Okay. And then, so Noah believed in God.
Yes.
Before Abraham ever did.
Correct.
Okay. So if you're saying this, then, so here's my brain going, okay. So Moses did write the Ten Commandments because he got all the information from Noah.
Except that Noah didn't have the Ten Commandments.
So what you're saying is, based on word of mouth, Moses, I mean, I know he, see, I'm confused because I got to tell you.
I think you have to divide belief in God and religion, Judaism. They're two separate things within the same arena. Adam was created by God. Adam and Eve were created by God.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to have a drink because this is like really.
They spoke to God. And speaking to God, they knew him. They knew God. They were in the Garden of Eden until they ate from the tree of knowledge and they were expelled. So they had an intimate relationship with God. Noah lived 930 years, had children and grandchildren, great-grandchildren, 10 generations, 12 generations, maybe more. Did he forget to tell them that there was a God? Did they not know that there was a God?
Mm-hmm.
They did. How did they start serving idols? That's another question. How do you go from Adam, who knew God, Adam and Eve knew God intimately, and then their children and grandchildren serving idols? There's a reason for that. But they had that relationship. And there were other righteous men that the Torah says, this was a righteous man, this was a righteous man, etc. Noah was a righteous man, right? The second of,
for his generation.
Well, depending on two different bins. One said for his generation, one says in any generation. But the point is that he was a man of God.
Mm-hmm.
Well, what did that mean until the giving of the Torah? What did it mean to be a man of God? And then what does it mean? Why is Abraham so special? Clearly, he wasn't the first person to have a relationship with God. That should be obvious. Adam and Eve, at the very least, they had, because they were created by God, made them, put them there, never talked to them again. We know he talked to them. Where are you? What did he do? Right? We know that they had interactions. So when you talk about the belief in God or the relationship with God, other men and women had that relationship. But that relationship is not something that they discovered on their own. That was a relationship that was given to them. Adam was created by God. Adam and Eve were created by God. So they knew their creator. You know where you come from. You met your parents. Noah and the people between the two between Adam and Noah, those were the people they knew each other, so they learned from each other about God. What they were told. What's even less known about it is that God gave Adam 6 laws, and then after the flood, God added a 7th, and then it's called the 7 Noahide laws.
Mm-hmm.
Believe in one God, don't serve idols, don't kill, don't steal, have laws of marriage, no adultery. Mm-hmm. And setting up courts, a system of justice. Until the flood, man was forbidden to eat animals. After the flood, it was permitted, and therefore another one was added, which is the 7th, not to eat a limb off of a living animal, animal cruelty, etc. They're called the 7 Noahide laws, and there are many people today that observe the 7 Noahide laws. Those are the 7 precepts by which mankind lives and is godly and has a relationship with God. That has nothing to do with the 10 Commandments, which were given to the Jewish people. Okay. That has nothing to do with the Torah that was given to.
Okay.
So and by the way, it took 2,448 years from creation till God gave the Torah. So what was there before? There was God created a world and waited 2,500 years for anybody to figure it out, and there was no everybody just ran wild. So there's a system in here that God already put into place of godliness and spirituality that exists outside of the Torah. So there wasn't like there was this need for Moses to come and suddenly reinvent everything. So when Abraham became the first Jew, what does that mean? That Abraham recognized God on his own, and he went on self-sacrifice to promote monotheism, etc., etc. God said, "This is my guy, this is my family," and then from there, the Jewish people, and then God gave the Torah to the Jewish people. That's already another point to all of this. So there was no necessity for this. It's not like, Abraham was a monotheist. Abraham didn't have the Torah. Isaac was a monotheist. He didn't have the Torah. Jacob, his children, and the 210 years that the Israelites were in Egypt, they didn't have the Torah. So they could have continued to have a very godly life. There was no, in other words, the necessity that Moses had no need to create a Torah in order to create the Jewish people. They already existed. Mm-hmm. For 430 years, more or less, from when Abraham...
So basically, Moses wrote down the stories that Noah told him about.
Well, no, because Moses never met Noah. But God told him. Because
you're right. You're right.
Yeah, but yes.
But Abraham, it was
They knew of obviously certain things and episodes that happened, but the verses as we have it, God said to Moses, God said to Noah, God said, all those verses, that's word for word what God dictated to Moses to put onto parchment.
And we know that because how?
How do we know that?
Yes.
We know that because we saw. How do we know that we saw? Because we saw what happened. We saw the experience. We experienced it at the mountain of Sinai. They heard God's voice. They heard what was happening. They heard what was said. And when you look at those verses, and here's the other thing. If I was going to write a Bible, it would look nothing like the 5 books of Moses. They're literary. They're not very well written. They're very confusing, and they leave out a lot of very important details. For example, Abraham, who's supposed to be the first Jew and supposed to be this most amazing person and everything else, you kind of meet him when he's born, and then at the end of the second portion of the Torah, and then the third portion begins with he's leaving his parents' home. He's going to 75 years.
Yeah.
When did he discover God? Why is he leaving? When did he create this relationship? What happened to him? That's all gone. And then he gets to Israel, and you're like, oh, finally, this is great. His life is perfect. No, Egypt. When he goes down to Egypt, and his wife gets kidnapped, and she almost gets raped by Pharaoh. Would you put that in the Bible? And then she can't have kids. All the problem. Then she can't have kids. So when she leaves with a Egyptian princess as a gift to be her maid, and she tells her husband, why don't you marry him? And then he has a son. Would you put that in the Bible? Or would you want?
Because it was like blasphemy. Then.
Why would you want to create an environment which later on can lead to somebody else coming in saying, I'm the true heir? And you're like, well, no, that will never happen. Well, guess what it did? Because the Muslims say that that Yishmael was the firstborn son, and therefore we're the rightful owners or the rightful inheritors. So would you put that in your Bible? No. So piece by piece, if you go story by story, it gets more and more perplexing. So clearly, whoever was the author of the Torah was not trying to write a history book, and was not trying to write a book that showed the supremacy and only the good things that happened, because you wouldn't write a Bible like that. How would you write a Bible? First of all, you'd write laws. Why would you write stories? Do this, don't do this.
But stories are really good in the fact that we can identify with the characters.
And do what with them?
Improve ourselves based upon...
Based on what? If you look at the stories, like Judah,
I know.
who ended up with who lost his wife, and then he ends up with going. His daughter-in-law has to trick him, and then she gets pregnant by him, and he almost we should learn from that they sold their brothers, that they were going to kill their brother, and then they sold him, and instead they lied to their father and said
on what not to do. How about what not to do?
On what not to do. There's other stories you can.
Yeah.
I don't know. As a religion, it's pretty like, here, let me tell you a bunch of stories of how you shouldn't behave.
Yeah.
Well, when was the last time you raised your children? You ever think about raising them in the negative? Here, I'm not going to tell you what to do, but let me tell you what you shouldn't do. Don't do this. Don't do this. Don't do this. Well, if I'm not doing any of this, what am I doing? Well, now that you figure that out. It doesn't work. You want so when you talk about the Torah clearly was not written as a book that was supposed to be historical, because it's missing a ton of details. It's not written as a book of laws because the laws make no sense.
Right.
It says in the Shema, you should put the totafot between your eyes.
What's that?
What is it?
Yeah.
So Rashi comments, he says, well, tat and pat are two words in two African dialects that mean two and two are four. That means the four cabinets of the tefillin that go on your head. There's no Hebrew word to say four. It doesn't describe what goes on your head, where it goes on your head, what it should look like, what should be inside it.
We had to figure that out.
And it says you should write on your doorposts. Have you ever written anything on your doorpost?
Never.
So what do you have on your doorpost?
A mezuzah.
A mezuzah. Well, why is it in a mezuzah? Why is it in a case? Why is it written? Well, who should be? So clearly, and that's a whole separate question of the oral tradition. Where does the oral tradition come from? But the point is that as a book of laws, it doesn't make sense. As a book of stories, it makes no sense. As a book of history, it makes no sense. As a book of laws, it makes no sense.
So I was under the impression, and my own impression, I may say, in studying this, that the Torah is, once you get past the layers, there's a lot of codes there that Moses couldn't have possibly known about in this world. For example, kosher. He didn't know about all the kosher animals.
That's true.
And he didn't know about all the animals because he was only in this one area.
That's true.
So, with that being said, maybe God wrote it. If there's a God,
that certainly plays into, and that's what we're talking about the study. When you study and you see something like that, you say to yourself, "Hold on one second." Okay, but I think you brought up layers.
Yeah.
So what's interesting is that in Kabbalah it talks about the Torah being the blueprint of creation. Now, I'm old enough to remember what blueprints were actually blueprints and not computer-generated things when they're actually. And that's basically a good way to look at it. When you look at an untrained architect or an untrained engineer, and you look at blueprints, what do you see? You see chaos.
Yes.
You just see a bunch of numbers, lines, things, all kinds of things. You can say, who wrote this? I wanted a house. I know what my house has got to look like. I want a vision. Can you give me a 3D model? Today you can get a 3D model. But back in the day, you kind of had to, maybe the artist make a rough rendering, kind of what it was going to look like, but there certainly wasn't a 3D box, like you could actually see it and experience it and feel the differences, and they can even put the furniture in there today, like as if you're living in there. So you look at this thing and you say to yourself, what is this? And in some ways, the Torah is the same way. The verses are not just verses that come and tell you a story about something that happened. God said to Moses, X, Y, or Z, or Abraham had a conversation with Isaac. If you look at it from the Kabbalah lens, you're going to see a totally different conversation. When you look at it from the legal perspective, you're going to see it from a different conversation. Each page, this one is electrical, this one is the HVAC, this one is the property setbacks. Each one has a different angle, and each one on its own sometimes looks contradictory to the other one. And yet when you put it all together and you build it, you see what you have. So the Torah is really the blueprint of the world. And it's also the world. The word Torah itself comes from the word hara'ah, which is a lesson. When you look in it, you find from it, you glean from it the proper way to live your life, not because it's historical. I'm reading a story, don't behave. Yeah, certainly there's moral and ethical stories that are in the Torah. Not just the laws, and certainly there are laws in the Torah, but it's the complete package. So how do you know the Torah is true? I can tell you what Rambam says. Maimonides says, the Torah is true, as I said before, because our parents have passed it down to us from generation to generation. And 3,300 years ago, there's no Romans, there's no Greeks, there's no Persians, there's nothing. We're here. But how do I know that it's true? How can you know that it's true? If you dedicate time to studying the Torah, the more you study, the more you internalize its own veracity.
And you question a lot.
You have to question. If you don't question, then you're never going to get anywhere. But the point of it is that you know it's true because it becomes a living part of who we are, and we know that it impacts us, it moves us because it is a part of who we are.
Okay, so let me ask you something. Why? Hold on, I'm trying to get my history here. Why didn't Noah, because the whole world was supposedly destroyed, why didn't Noah write all of this stuff down and hand it off to the history that he got from...
But who said he didn't?
Where is it?
Well, first of all, there were libraries in antiquity, and people wrote down the story of the flood. Appears in different versions, in different cultures as well. The Torah is not the only historical document that has a story. So clearly, they did share. There were common ancestors, or common descendants from Noah. So there are stories of different things that.
But the documents are not around.
Most things were destroyed in antiquities. What still exists from antiquity? So we don't have much. But even the stories as they were recorded would have been recorded somewhat differently. Even when you look at, let's say, if you want to know what happened to Abraham from birth until the age of 75, you look in Medrash, and the Medrash will fill us in on many different details of what was going on. So even just because the 5 books of Moses didn't include something doesn't mean it's not part of Torah. There are other areas of Torah in the oral tradition that record various pieces, and those were incorporated into different books of the oral law, which has its own.
That's for a different discussion.
And it has its own designation.
Yeah.
But the point is, if you want to know that the Torah is true, study Torah.
Okay.
That's the best way to really appreciate it. I can give you a formula, and it'll work, it won't work. You accept it, or you don't accept it, but you're not going to know that it's true. You're going to have, like, do you know that George Washington lived, that he had a cherry tree that he didn't have? Apparently, there was no cherry tree. He never cut it down. So that never happened. How do you know that George Washington was real? Well, because you were taught that there was a guy named George Washington and he did X, Y, and Z.
All right.
Do you really want to know that he existed? Read his books and read all of his different and who he was and his writings, and you'll get a sense. And then he's not just going to be real. He won't just exist, but he'll be real for you.
All right. Thank you.
L'chaim.
That's for another. Thank you, Rabbi. Again, log on to, what's it called?
Well, questions at betweenthelachayim.com, and send us your questions and your comments, and we'd really love to hear from you. And l'chaim to everyone.
L'chaim. Thank you, Rabbi. We'll see you next week.